Chapter 4. The Violin. Perhaps more than any other orchestral instrument, the violin is the ultimate showpiece for virtuosity. The musical feats of legendary violin virtuosos, such as Niccolò Paganini, Fritz Kreisler, and Jascha Heifetz, and Itzhak Perlman, they're astounding. To see the score of a Paganini caprice is a double wonder. How did a composer imagine such a torrent of notes, and how could a mere mortal actually play them with precision, tone, and emotion? Oh, he is gifted, people will say of a stellar violinist. He's a natural, say others. Well, you know, he started when he was 4, exclaims a third, as if that explained it all. But with Perlman, for example, would his genius have been lost had he not, just by chance, heard a violin concerto on the radio when he was a mere 3? What was it that so stirred that toddler that he knew right then and there that he wanted to play that instrument? He taught himself at first on a toy fiddle, being denied admission to a music conservatory because he was too small to hold a real violin. But he was studying in earnest when he was still only 5. Had that serendipitous event not happened, might he have instead got into the lingerie business on 7th Avenue in New York, and later retired to Florida to get a good copper-tone tan and play gin rummy with other Sun Belt emigres near the beach? And if that radio broadcast had been a flute or oboe concerto, would he have been just as captivated and become just as great on either of those instruments? Or is there something inevitable about genius finding its true path in life? None of that speculation applies to me as I move on to the violin. Parallels are not often drawn between the violin and the bagpipes, the one making angelic music that can bring tears to our eyes with emotion of love and longing, and the other with its fortissimo-only boldness that can either bring tears to our eyes and expletives to our lips, or stir the heart with strength and courage, even leading men into battle as late as the Second World War. The violin crumbles our defenses and finds resonance in the inner reaches of our souls. The bagpipes stiffen our resolve and prod us to dare to go where none have gone before. But there is a parallel. It lies in how unmitigatedly awful they each sound in the hands of a beginner. I know that every master starts as a novice, but the sounds of a violin in the hands of a beginner are teeth-gratingly abominable, just like the bagpipes. They might do battle with each other to see which sounds most like a shrieking cat being twirled by its tail around the head of a sadistic madman. Bagpipes have an excuse. The instrument is the devil to tune, especially in the days before plastic, when the reeds really were made of natural cane from bamboo. Among the myriad, mostly bad, bagpipe jokes is the one that pipers spend half their time tuning and the other half playing out of tune. To wit, a piper friend was hired to play at a Kirkin of the tartan. It's a ceremony at the local church, a service to bless the tartan of a Scottish-American family. She arrived early and spent a solid half hour laboriously coaxing her pipes into tune. She laid them down carefully on a desk in a basement classroom, shut the door firmly, and went to the restroom. Emerging much relieved, she was startled to hear someone blowing her pipes, horribly out of tune, and after all the effort she had gone through to put them to rights. Outraged, she stormed back to the classroom, flung open the door, and stood with hands on hips ready to give the miscreant a thorough dressing down, only to find her pipes untouched on the desk, and the bagpipe-like sound coming from a vacuum cleaner being pushed around the church by a custodian. But a beginning violin player has no such excuses. The instrument is perfectly innocent. When it sounds bad, it is not the violin's fault. The failure to make it sound sweet and heavenly lies completely at the feet or hands of the player. The violin is, so far at least, the only instrument that has prompted Doyen to ask with a polite, "If you don't mind," if I would close the door tightly before practicing. I cannot blame her. My early sessions are excruciating. It is not even remotely musical, but does resemble the sound effects track of a screeching train, a door in badly need of oil, and feedback from a faulty PA system. It is too bad that it sounded so rough and scratchy in my hands so far, because everything else about the violin is delicate and refined. The violin case is beautiful, with a hard pebbled grain, black on the outside and plush red velour on the inside to protect the instrument. But it is misleading in its elegance. There ought to be a warning label on it saying, "Attention! Read carefully before using. Might cause animals and small children to flee and plants to shrivel up. Close all windows and doors before use. Prolonged exposure may lead to stiff neck, deafness, and loss of friends. Not responsible for side effects, which may include ringing in the ears, grinding of the teeth, sudden panic among housemates, prolonged isolation from human contact, and the fantasies of ever playing anything remotely resembling music on this thing." If there ever was a raw recruit for the violin, I am it. Nothing about the bass or cello has prepared me for this. Even the basic posture is unnatural. Want to know what it feels like to hold a violin? Try walking around the house with an apple between your chin and collarbone for a while. Nevertheless, as with almost anything we try that is new, even a dreadful beginning does not last forever. And with practice, what was at first awkward becomes more familiar and easier. In fact, much to my surprise, I'm actually making progress faster than on the cello or bass. It could be that since the violin is my third string instrument, if I had changed the order, whichever instrument was third would have been the easier one. I will never know for sure, but I speculate that it has something to do with the higher pitch of the violin compared to the bass or cello. I seem to hear the notes clearly, and so I can stay in tune most of the time. Playing off pitch isn't ever good, but it is not so awfully bad if you are alone, because even if you slide a little flat or a little sharp, you will still be in relative tune with yourself. But you cannot get away with that when playing in an ensemble, be it a duet, trio, quartet, or a larger group. When you are off, the entire harmonic balance is thrown out of kilter, and it simply sounds like a bunch of middle schoolers satisfying a music requirement. That may be an obscure reference, but if you have ever been to a middle school concert, you know what I mean. Despite the misdirected plaudits of "good job" thrown at the young players by well-meaning friends and parents, it really wasn't a good job. It was barely tolerable. But woe to the person who doesn't smile bravely at the conclusion of the concert before scurrying home for a soothing, nerve-settling nightcap. I've often thought that middle school music teachers have the patience of a saint. They are musicians, after all, with a musician's ear, some with perfect pitch, who are nevertheless relentlessly, day after day, subjected to such an ear-splitting cacophony of unmusical sounds that it would drive an ordinary person crazy. I've walked past a middle school music class and paused to try to figure out what instruments were in there. Some sounds were unrecognizable, yet these selfless teachers persist, and in many cases introduce 12 and 13-year-olds to a world of music that just might lay the groundwork for a lifetime of enjoyment. Priscilla Arasaki, my violin teacher, is a Suzuki follower, to the letter. The method is so prescribed that you can go from one Suzuki teacher to another, from New York to Stockholm, to Istanbul, to Bangkok, and if you are on page 5 of book 2 in one place, you can pick right up at the same point no matter where you are or who you have as a teacher. The immutability of the method doesn't quite offend me, but the rigidity of it is contrary to my worldview, which tends strongly toward adaptability, alteration, and concessions to the individual. With the Suzuki method, everyone is assigned the same tunes and plays them the same way. When you watch a group Suzuki recital, every violin is in exactly the same position under the jaw, and each bow stroke describes the same exact arc, as much mechanical as musical. It can get a bit monotonous playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or Go Talent Rhodey, and other similar ditties over and over again, but there's a method to the madness. Each earworming tune has in it a technical challenge that develops certain skills so you can move on from book 1 to book 2, and then 3, and so forth, all the way up to book 10. Some tunes help with string crossings, moving smoothly from one string to another, or slurring the notes in one upward or downward stroke of the bow, while others focus on tone, smoothness, staccato, and playing louder or softer. There are some adult Suzuki students, like me, but the overwhelming majority are children, some as young as 3 years old. The method relies heavily on playing by ear and involves joint participation from a parent or other adult. The need to read music is minimized and put off until much later, sometimes only when the student wants to play in a school orchestra or realizes that reading music is absolutely essential to progressing. Misgivings aside, I find it easier to play more fluently sooner with Suzuki, at least with the pieces that are in the curriculum. But it really is and really does feel like a class, and that I am in school again. When I look back at what I was playing at the same point in time on the bass or cello, the music was much more challenging. It seems as though the Suzuki method is especially good if you're in it for the long haul, and most Suzuki students are. Despite the repetition, or as a Suzuki enthusiast would say, because of it, I am ready to consider the end piece. It is time to pick an excerpt from the classical music repertoire and try to play it so that it is at least reasonably listenable. The literature is virtually unlimited. Everybody wrote for the violin, and the instrument seems to have been an instant hit with the composers as soon as it sprang, seemingly fully formed, like Pegasus from the head of Medusa, in the middle 1500s. Antecedents of the violin were from the Far East, but there is a huge leap from the bowed Chinese erhu, or Arab rabab, to the European violin. The violin's direct antecedent, the viol or viol, as it is called sometimes, looked somewhat similar and came almost a century earlier, but it was larger. You could not hold it under your chin. It was pitched much lower, had 5 to 7 strings, and was tuned in fourths like the bass, not fifths like the violin. It also had a fretted fingerboard, unlike the violin. So how did the violin burst on the scene from the workshop of Andreas Amati around 1550? It was not magic, but the evolution happened very quickly. A mere 20 years passed between the first documented appearance of a violin, albeit one with only 3 strings, in a painting by Guadenzio Ferrari in 1530, and the first attributable violin made by the aforementioned Andreas Amati in Cremona, Italy, in 1550. Who made the violin in the painting is still unknown, but accounts of the sound during those gap years talk about a softer tone, and yes, drone strings, just like the drones on the unalterable bagpipes. Although Amati is credited with having made the first violin, others appeared so close on his heels that it is likely that other renowned Italian luthiers, craftsmen such as Guarneri, Ruggieri, Stradivari, and de Salo, were making instruments of similar quality almost simultaneously. Like Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, working on a vaccine for polio at the same time in the mid-1950s, or Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, coming up with the theory of natural selection independently in 1858. This kind of world-changing coincidence and the breakthroughs it entails is far from rare. It must have been a frenzied and exciting time in Cremona and its environs that the luthier families vied with each other to lay claim to the prized forest in Lombardy to harvest the spruce and maple trees needed for their violins. It may not be a stretch of the imagination to picture one of the Amati sons at the end of the day in his father's workshop, trudging down a cobblestone street to stop at a local taverna to slake his thirst. Spotting a fellow luthier from the house of Stradivari, he invites the fellow to join him for a drink. In a dark corner, they find a thick wooden table and pull up a couple of 3-legged stools. The Amati orders leather flagons of wine, and with elbows on the tabletop, they talk about everything except what they really want to know. Both feigning affability and innocence, each one is trying to wheedle out of the other information on the secret details of how they make their violins. The Stradivari orders a second round, and in faux loving fellowship, The Amati shouts for a third. Rumor has it that a new Stradivarius has a superior sound, and Amati would love to know what slight adjustments his rival has made to achieve it. It could be the height of the bridge, or the length and angle of the neck. Perhaps they have changed the depth of the bouts, the position of that sound post, or the chemistry of the varnish. Yes, it might be the varnish. These are the trade secrets that Stradivarius might let slip, especially with another round or mug or two of wine. And so it could have gone. It's not hard to see that corporate espionage was deep roots and has not essentially changed very much over the centuries. With all this history buzzing around in my head, I sit down to think about my end piece and conjure up images of sculptured busts of the great composers. Here is the scowling Beethoven and the youthful Mozart, and Papa Haydn with his powdered wig. The pen I pick up, in my mind's eye, transforms into a feathered quill, and as I dip its point into the imaginary inkwell on my desk and write slowly, it practically sends shivers down my spine. Seeing the names appear at the tip of my pen, my quill, letter by letter, is an emotional connection to the flesh and blood person. B-A-C-H. B-R-A-H-M-S. And for some reason, especially S-A-I-N-T-S-A-E-N-S. The letters flow together as I write his name, as if they were music itself. It feels like he is moving my hand as I write his name. I dream one night, in a wonderful mixed metaphor that is only allowed in the world of dreaming, that I am watching Camille Saint-Saëns himself, as he autographs a clean white baseball with its raised red seams that I hold in my hand, standing along the third base line of a LA Dodgers home game. Ultimately, I decide not on the Saint-Saëns, but on the Bach Air on a G-string, the arched eyebrows of my teacher notwithstanding. The violin and I have made our peace, and I am making music. Doyen even told me I don't have to close the door anymore. It gets to be the day before my 11th lesson. I am playing the Bach Air pretty smoothly, and it is just a smidge away from being at least reasonably listenable, and maybe even better than that. I am eager to play for my teacher to show her the marked progress from the last lesson. But the vagaries of thinking you know something when you really don't strike me hard. The lesson is a disaster. I play wrong notes, I'm out of tune, and screech and scratch with a bow like a parody of the violin student. Victor Borge or Peter Schickele as P.D.Q. Bach would have had a field day with me. "Someone please feed the cat," might be a wry Borge remark, while P.D.Q. Bach could add, when was that written? Yes, I see now. Of course, it was written in a hurry, in broken thirds, in the key of B very flat major awfully diminished. I can't seem to get my left hand to recognize my right hand. They are like perfect strangers who are reluctant even to acknowledge the other's existence, much less be cordial or give a thought to working together cooperatively. "What piece is that you're playing?" Mr. Left would remark archly. "It's vaguely familiar." "It's the same one you're supposed to be playing," would come the acid reply from Mr. Right. Something inside me wants to play the air really well, not just reasonably listenable, but smooth and even. I wanted to conjure up the image of a punt, gracefully gliding across the surface of a still pond, with weeping willows along the shore dipping the tips of their feathery branches into the water, and pastel flowers dotting the mossy green banks. Perhaps my standards have gone up, and the level of proficiency that I achieved on the bass and cello is no longer good enough. It is my subconscious at work, and I think it is influenced by a historical fiction book I just finished by the eminent psychiatrist Irvin Yalom. It is all about unconscious motivation and the angst that goes along with not being able to master it. In the book, it rules the two main characters, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and Freud's early mentor, Josef Breuer. In real life, they never actually met, but it is an engrossing story and there's a lot of worrying in the book. I find that it's making me worry, too. I am worried about not being able to play the air as well as I want to. This is not what I planned. The whole idea for this is to be an adventure, an experiment of sorts, to see just what happens when each instrument. No outcome is preordained. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be. It is to be a balance between the process and the results. But now the results are dominating my thoughts, and I wake up one morning calculating how many hours I can practice before my last lesson. I am doing what my violin teacher told me to do, which is after the requisite Suzuki Book 1 warm-ups, to play the air at least 10 times a day. But it is not helping. In fact, it's getting worse. I share this with Chris, my cello teacher. Remember, I liked the cello so much I decided to keep taking lessons? It is 2 days before the day of reckoning, and she says, stop playing altogether. Put away the violin, don't play it all tomorrow, then play it through just a couple of times before your lesson. Are you serious? Trust me, she says. Uh-oh. Whenever I hear the words trust me, it raises a red flag. It makes me feel a little leery about what might happen. Like the used car salesman who says, trust me, it runs like new, only to have the transmission drop out the next day. Or when a roofer says, trust me, has you skidding like an octopus over the house with pails to catch the leaks the first time it rains. Personally, I stopped using trust me 37 years ago, on a vacation in Hawaii with Doyen. We chose the former leper colony island of Molokai, because it was less touristy than Maui, Kauai, or the Big Island, and while the leper colony is still there as a historic site, it closed as a leper center in 1969. The lure of a very beautiful, small island with only one resort hotel was irresistible. One day, we discovered an isolated crescent-shaped lagoon, lined with leaning palm trees, explosively colored exotic flowers, and hanging vines. We swam lazily in the warm water of our private beach paradise until the sun started to go down. Scantily clad as we both were, we almost felt like Adam and Eve. But with no apple tree in sight, we decided against that pretense. Instead, inspired by the steamy foliage, we channeled Tarzan and Jane, when lo and behold, just ahead on the path we were walking on was a dangling vine. Doyen, I enthused. Grab that vine and swing across that puddle while I take your picture. Are you sure it will hold me? Trust me, I said. We are still married, but that was the last time I used that phrase. I don't have much time to dither over whether or not to trust Chris and take her advice, but my playing does not improve, so I put the violin away and try not to think about it for what feels like a very long day without practice. I slept well that night and spent the pre-lesson time the next day playing tennis, reading, taking a nice long walk with Doyen, and just casually playing through the air a couple of times. I was pretending that how it sounded really meant nothing to me, something like whistling in the dark to scare away the ghosts and goblins. At the lesson, which to me and my high expectations practically felt like an audition, I play the air as well as I ever have. It is certainly reasonably listenable, and maybe a notch above. I think of what Chris told me and realize that trust is a profoundly deep belief in life, and that it is important not to reject trust me out of hand without considering the source. When warranted, the value of trust is inestimable. Trust me.